Welcome back, everyone. I'm Billy. This is a vintage knitting podcast. You can see that I'm wearing a 1930s Fair Isle number.
And action.
I try and bring you something fresh and new every week, whether it's my own knitting or things that other people are knitting from vintage patterns or vintage inspired patterns. Today, I do have a guest, but before I bring her on, I just wanted to remind you that you can also find me on Instagram and Ravelry at Billy Toy, and I'll put that on the screen for you to see. I'll be right back with my guest. Don't go away. So good morning and welcome back to Show and Tell. This morning I have a guest with me. Her name is Liz Kristan, and she is a knitting historian. I'm going to let her tell you about where she resides and something about her town, which is what I ask all of my guests in case this pandemic should end and we start to travel again. You might want to go to where she is and find something cute to see. And then we're going to start to talk about all things knitting. Liz, take it away.
Hi, so I live in Grayslake, Illinois. It's about an hour north of Chicago and an hour south of Milwaukee. It's most famous for being the center of the Grayslake Gelatin factory, which existed from the late 19th to early 20th centuries. They still have the giant smokestack from the former factory. The factory no longer exists, but they left the smokestack up. And it's right by our downtown in the middle of a park. And it's this huge brick tower that says Gelatin on the side. You can't miss it. And right across the street from it is a small local history museum. And they have tons of old cans and all this information on the Grayslake Gelatin factory. I see the cans of it every once in a while in antique stores. It's if you're into local history and small town history and Illinois history, definitely come to Grayslake and learn about the former gelatin factory.
That's perfect. That's exactly what we wouldn't find in any tour guide. You know, in New York, they take things like that and they turn them into condominiums. People like to live in old factories, and the quaintness of a smokestack is, really cool. We have those around New York. So how does one become a knitting historian?
Well, one thing I learned very quickly is that there's no way to get like a master's degree in it or anything like that. Unfortunately, it's not a very well represented field in academia. You could maybe get like a degree in fiber arts, but that's a little bit more focused towards people who are artists who are looking to like make exhibits that are based on knitting or quilting or things of that nature. Really what I became really interested in the history of knitting starting when I was a teenager. And I talk about it in my history of knitting program, that I was gifted a reprint of the Mary Frances Knitting and Crochet book from 1917. And I realized how wonderful it was that you could recreate things that our ancestors had made. And I got really interested in primary sources, particularly because you'll find that there aren't a lot of secondary sources when it comes to knitting history. You really have to look at the original texts. And I'm from the 90s, so I grew up with like the internet explosion, and a lot of museums and databases and libraries were scanning historical knitting patterns that were in the public domain and making them available online for anyone to use. And that was so exciting for me. I couldn't get enough of it. I was always searching out new databases and new uploads, looking at the Internet Archive and the Antique Pattern Library. And kind of, it was just something that I always did, like on the weekends and in the evenings, and always reading and always studying. And one day I wore a shawl to work that I had just finished knitting. And one of my coworkers asked me about the history of the stitches that were in it. It was kind of a mosaic stitch shawl. And so I was telling her about like Barbara Walker's work to popularize mosaic knitting. And she said, have you ever considered doing a program about the history of knitting for the library? because I'm a librarian. I've done a lot of library programs. And it was like, well, I've never thought of it, but sure, why not? So I made a little PowerPoint and just showed everybody some examples of things I had made. I brought some historical props, and there ended up being a pretty good sized demand for it. I wasn't expecting that. So I've done it, the history knitting program at a lot of other libraries. I've guested on other podcasts. I've helped some journalists write articles on knitting. It just kind of exploded from there. So I kind of just fell into it.
So that's how I found you, the Gale Borden Library, the talk that you gave there. And I will put a link in the show notes so that everyone can go and watch that, because it starts in the 10th century and goes to modern times. So don't miss watching that. That's fabulous. I also found a podcast that you did, just an audio podcast about the socks that won World War I.
Yes.
So I'll leave a link to that as well, because I know that you brought some of your own knitting and other ephemera and other things, I don't know, some of your collection to show us. But before you do that, I wanted to go back to the comments you just made. This business of what is in the public domain is a perplexing one to knitters. And we often see people selling patterns on Etsy and eBay, and we're never sure, are these kosher? Is it legal for them to be selling it? I've tried to look up some of the patent law. I know it's different in the United States and the UK, but it seems like you've delved into this in a much more professional way. What can you tell us about, when is it okay to use something? How do you know if it's still under copyright?
Well, anything that's published in 1923 or earlier is in the public domain, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop that. Nobody can.
Worldwide? That's worldwide?
No, that's the US.
United States, okay. But a lot of the patterns are in the UK and Australia. Do you know about those other English-speaking countries?
I'm not as familiar with theirs, unfortunately.
Okay.
I couldn't really comment on them. Anything though in the US that was published 1973, between, I should say, 1924 and 1973 has the option for renewal. If it's not renewed, it's in the public domain, but they could choose to renew it at any time. So the hard part is knowing whether or not something was renewed. And the Library of Congress is not easy to search. Their copyright records are really difficult to find and difficult for a layperson to understand. I don't really, unfortunately, and like I said, I'm a librarian, so this is something that I should understand better, but I can't find a good way to individually search by patterns that isn't massively labor intensive. The Library of Congress needs to make it easier.
Well, in Australia, they have something called Trove, a website called Trove, where they have cataloged many, many knitting patterns from old newspapers, but those are after the era that you're talking about. You can't sell them, I don't think, because they probably still are under some Australian copyright, but I don't know, it's perplexing to me. I guess we still have to wait another 10 or 20 years before everything is like fair game.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So what have you brought today to show us?
Well, I brought a little medley of things. I brought a few things that I have knit that I have not shown at any of my history of knitting presentations, so you'll be the first to see them. I brought some vintage yarn that I've collected, so you can kind of see the labels. I brought some vintage knitting needles, so you can see kind of how they've evolved over the years. I brought a World War I era postcard about knitting, and that's also a World War I era sheet music about knitting.
I'm hoping soon to interview a woman who collects sheet music pertaining to knitting. And I'm also planning to interview a woman who sings the songs from that sheet music. Be on the lookout for them.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah, so thought I'd kind of just give you a little tour. Yeah, because I'm a thrift store aficionado, estate sale crazy person, and I love looking for anything knitting ephemera. So this one is, I'll start with something really simple here. So this is just a really basic World War II era knitting pattern for a very casual sweater. The photo of the lady wearing the sweater, she's gardening, she's got her hair tied up in a handkerchief, you know, it's just a really everyday sweater. So it's dark gray, so it's a little hard to see, but it's got sort of a saddle shoulder with garter stitch there, and long ribbing on the sleeves there, so you can push them up. Just very simple. I've worn it a couple times already, so there's a little pilling under the arms, but
It seems rather unisex.
it is, yeah. It's very just utilitarian. You know, you don't really think of 1940s patterns without the big shoulder pads or something, but it's just really utilitarian. It's just meant for everyday wear, something to wear to work, something to wear in the garden, that kind of thing.
That sweater was so popular when I was in high school. So now I'm going to date myself. If you were in Philadelphia, as I was growing up, there was a company called The Villager. I guess it was in New York, probably nationwide. I don't know if it was such a big trend. This was in the late 60s. You were not in and with it if you weren't wearing Villager or Ladybug. And that was the style, just that very classic saddle shoulder, crew neck sweater, solid color. And then you had to have like the matching skirt with the matching knee socks. And there was a special shoe that had little fringe on the front, Weegens. It was sort of like a mix between a loafer and a moccasin. It was like a uniform. And and there was like a blouse with little prints, little floral prints that had a Peter Pan collar, and everybody wore a circular initial pin. I'm telling you, everyone in my high school, pretty much, if they could afford these clothes, were wearing this uniform in an array of colors. So that sweater that you showed is quite familiar to me. I had several of them.
Well, they're so comfortable and they kind of go with everything, so I get it. And then here's another one that I made from a 1940s pattern. This one is actually from a pattern booklet that was intended for women who were in the services. So during World War II, it seems to me, at least, I'm not a uniform expert, so I could be wrong, but a lot of the knitting patterns that I see, especially for women's uniforms, don't seem to be super rigid about like what branch of the forces they were in. I don't know if they weren't being held to extremely high standards for knitwear, or if they all were similar enough. That I can't say, because like I said, I'm not a uniform expert, but this was just like a knits for women in the armed forces. So here's a little waistcoat, kind of curled in on itself a little bit there. But you can see it's just a very simple rib. There's a little bit of shaping, and it's got that pointed front there. And then I just used some 1960s buttons that I had found at an estate sale. And yeah, it's a little cutie. It's good. It's another like good for casual wear, and you're sort of like secretly wearing historical clothing, but maybe nobody could tell, or at least I don't think people can tell. And then one last one from the 40s. I went through a really big 40s kick during the pandemic. I don't know why, just something about the silhouette was just really getting me. This is my fanciest 40s sweater for sure. So this one is very classic 40s with the big pleated, like big puffy sleeves. Maybe you'll see. We've got, I love the way that they did the collar in the pattern. It's got like like kind of like a double knit edge. So it's got a little weight to it. So the collar actually stays down really nicely. And it's got like a little bow tie there at the front. And I used real 1940s celluloid buttons for the front. It's also got that like kind of like where the yoke is really fitted, but then there's like a lot of pleating right here over the chest to kind of give it that full look. And then it like cinches right back down at the waist. And it calls for all these little snaps. So that way you can keep that waist, like there's no gapping or rippling over your stomach. It's like really tailored looking. And then in the back has also like a little kind of a line, garter stitch line there for their reverse stockinette line for the yoke. So you can kind of has almost like a sailor collar look. So it's kind of like a rectangle on your back. I love this. I saw the pattern and I couldn't help myself. I really had to make it.
It's very smart. I can see why that silhouette would appeal to you. And it's interesting. The things are not outlandish. You know, it's not the Joan Crawford really gigantic shoulders. I mean, these things blend in with contemporary knitwear. So you don't look like this.
Yeah, no, I mean, you could definitely find some more costumey for these patterns if you wanted to. I really find, like I said with the vest, like things that are kind of sneaky and maybe don't look modern, but also don't look super pinned down to a single decade, and you can wear it like with a bunch of other things and change it up. Like those are my favorite things to make. And from the 50s, I did a really like Bobby Soxer style sweater. So this one's a cute little raglan with the crew neck and then the fitted waist, and it's got the 3/4 length sleeves. And I just did it in like a green variegated yarn. I got this yarn on vacation, so it's like my vacation sweater too. This is another style that I think really blends in well with modern day. I mean, you kind of have to wear more high-waisted jeans because of the high-waistedness of the 50s, but that's what I wear normally anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah, I like this one, especially with like a little brooch. It's a really good like costumey, but not costumey everyday look. It's a good one.
I could also see it with a little neckerchief.
Yeah.
A narrow band.
Yeah, I'm also a brooch hoarder. I have a lot of them. So I had been sort of steadily collecting vintage yarn that I, again, was finding at estate sales and thrift stores. Usually you can only find like a skein or two at a time. It's really hard to get like a huge quantity. So I kind of was just collecting them for a little while. And then I realized, you know, I could use these, like, you know, if I look for the right kind of pattern that can accommodate that I maybe only have little odds and ends. So I actually got this pattern from Trove. It's a 1930s stripy scarf pattern. The colors, the yarns are all more from the 1950s based on the labels. So it's just a really simple, it's one by one rib. So it's all stretchy, which makes it like really nice and squishy. But yeah, it's all vintage yarn in here. I don't know. I love the way the greens came together. They were all different brands, but I think they look beautiful together.
It definitely has a vintage vibe, those colors.
Yes. And I was able to come across a sweaters quantity not that long ago and actually found a pattern that calls for that yarn that I had just enough of to make. It's off the needles right now because I need to frog it, but so it's actually, this is going to be when it grows up, it'll be a 1947 vest, and you can see there's all those slip stitches in there. At the end of it, you take another like contrasting shades of wool and you weave it in and out to create like a tartan look. It looks really cool.
Oh,
yes. So I'm really, again, I need to frog it, but when it's done, when it's all grown up, it'll be a very beautiful, very late post-war, you know, tartany goodness.
do you think that vintage patterns require more time to achieve because of those specific little things like weaving something through or embroidering something on?
I think it depends on the pattern. I've definitely encountered some, particularly from like the 1930s, I find, that are very detail oriented. Like the the red sweater I showed you, that's from the 40s, but it's in a lot of separate pieces that are seamed together at the end, and then like knitting the extra little bow, all those little snaps. Some of them are very detail oriented, some of them aren't. If you want the experience of using a vintage pattern, I don't think you should, but you know, maybe you're newer to knitting, you don't have to be afraid that they're all so very detail oriented. Some of them are definitely more accessible than others. But if you also are looking for the challenge and looking for something that's really fiddly and needs a lot of precision, you could go either way.
More and more, that's me.
Yeah.
I talked about this just yesterday with a group of my previous guests, that this is slow fashion. Like, I'm looking for things that take a long time because my output has become too high.
Yes.
And I'm running out of real estate.
I completely understand.
So I'm always looking for things that are going to take me 3 or 4 months to complete. So the more fiddly for me, probably the better.
If you're like me, I like have to compulsively knit. I love to listen to podcasts and audiobooks, and I need something to do with my hands while I do it. And knitting is my favorite thing to do with my hands. So.
I have a feeling that that is every single person watching this podcast.
Yes.
Please let us know if you're in that camp, because I'm definitely in that group.
Yes. So like if I'm sitting still, I have a confession. The route that I take to my commute to work, I cross a couple of train tracks, and some of them are like the commercial train tracks with those really long trains. I always put knitting in my work bag just in case I get stuck behind a train and I throw my car in park and just sit and knit till the train passes.
I thought you were going to tell me that you commute to work on public transportation and you specifically take a longer route so you have more time to knit. That's what I was expecting to hear.
No, and there have been times where I've gotten stuck behind a train and I've thought, oh good, I've got a train, I get to sit for a minute. Oh yeah. So now I thought I'd kind of transition to some of my like antiques. So you've seen the handmaids that I've brought, and we're gonna kind of start with some of the vintage yarns. So I've been asked a couple of times, like, how do you identify a vintage yarn and how do you date a vintage yarn? The very first thing that makes it really easy to tell roughly how old a yarn is there a barcode on the label? Because if there's a barcode, it's the 1970s or later. And if there's no barcode, it's earlier than that. So that's like step number one.
What about if there's no label? I mean, that's easy. What if there's no label?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would think scratchiness, the scratchiness factor.
Yes. And then I often feel that it's like lighter weight than yarn of the same, like, but not as airy, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like vintage yarns feel a little lighter compared to yarn of the same weight, but it's also denser, if that makes sense. I know that sounds weird, but it's not like there's going to be a lot of plies, but it won't feel as dense.
Do you have examples like that you could show us to compare to something that's modern?
I don't have modern with me, but I can show you some of my vintage stuff.
Okay.
So the other way that I date vintage yarn is I go to like newspapers.com. Your local library may have a free subscription to it, because otherwise it is like a monthly fee, but you may be able to go to your local library and use their subscription. What I do is I just type in the yarn's name and check the advertisements, because businesses would list yarns that they have for sale, and that'll give you at least a fairly rough window of when this yarn was being produced. And sometimes they'll have photos of the yarn and you can see the label, or it'll have a little drawing of the brand logo, so you can kind of get an idea of where things are. It's not perfect, but it'll give you a rough window. So that's how I date vintage yarn. So this first one here is from, I'm assuming it's pronounced Jaeger. It was a English company, but Bernat used to import some of their yarns to the US. So here's one of their Crinkle Spuns from the 1950s, 1960s. Bright green, very 50s looking, and it's all wool crepe yarn. And you almost never see, at least I don't ever see textured 100% wools like this anymore with that boucle. It's really pretty. But yeah, no, it's very cool. I like it. Oh, another good hint for telling if yarn is vintage or not. Does it go by weight or of the yarn, or does it go by yardage? Because vintage yarns will only say like 1 ounce, 2 ounce. They won't include the yardage. So that's another good hint. And then here's another kind of crinkly, this one's mohair from Bernat. And I got this at an estate sale, and it's another very 1950s color. But here's their Mohairlaine. And it's got a little, what is it called? They call it the Dupont nylon.
Very 50s.
Yes. And you can see that beautiful teal color. And again, that's sort of like, it's, you know, it's 1950s yarn. So it's a little bit matted together, but we love it anyway. It's still beautiful. And I love the like cross-stitched flowers all around the edge of the label there.
Sweet. Does it feel like if you lit a match to it that it would like melt?
Not really, because it's mostly mohair and wool. It's only 19% nylon, so it's not too plasticky feeling. And I think that's part of why you can see it's like kind of felted itself a little bit over the years. But no, it actually doesn't feel too plasticky. I do feel like you would probably be sneezy while you wear it though.
I had knit with mohair in the 80s. It's nothing like the mohair that we have today. It was very scratchy and longer fibers, but maybe not so natural. I don't know. I got rid of this big white puffy mohair sweater that I had knit simply because I just couldn't wear it. It probably made my nose itch, not sneeze, and it was scratchy. And I had done the whole entire sweater in it. It was gorgeous, but no, today, fortunately, it's different.
Yes, yeah. I was really excited by finding this yarn because this is the great grandparent of the ubiquitous Peaches and Cream Lily yarn. They've been making it for a very long time. It used to be called the Sugar and Cream. But it's the Lily cotton yarn, and this is probably post-war, I think, like fairly immediately post-war based on the logo. But yeah, it's the same. I compared it to another. It's like the same weight, the same feel, the same texture as those like the dishcloth yarn that everybody uses to make washcloths. But here it is, like in its earlier inception.
Isn't that interesting? I love the label, that two-tone. Is there anything about the font that would identify the period that it's from?
Well, it's mostly, like I said, going to like newspapers and looking at the advertisements for the yarns and looking at how the logo changed over the years. You know, again, companies tend to change like once every decade or every 15 years. So it gives you a fairly wide window, but at least you can see, oh, it's like post-war versus, you know, 1980s, you know?
Right.
And then here is something from Columbia Minerva, and this is a wool and rayon mix. It has, I have a little sample that I had knit up of it, and it actually has a really beautiful sheen. It's kind of shiny for being like just black. It catches the light a little bit. I think this was, yeah, you can see it's Lustrous Sparkletone is the name of the yarn. There's nothing sparkly about it other than the little bit of rayon content that just sort of catches the light. It seems like, I think this one wasn't made for a terribly long period of time. It was just from the early 50s. But yeah, I have found a couple patterns for cardigans. So I don't have quite enough to make a cardigan, but this is on my eBay saved search. So that if I ever come across more, I do want to make a cardigan out of it because I think it would be really pretty.
Have to be young to knit with black.
And then this is, so Red Heart, like everybody loves Red Heart for blankets. You know, it's that like workhorse acrylic yarn. Red Heart actually started its inception as a really, really basic wool yarn. And then it wasn't until about the 1960s, 1970s where they switched to Red Heart being primarily making acrylic yarns. So here is, it has a little Woolworths sticker on there. It once sold for 39 cents at Woolworths. But here's an original like Red Heart Coats and Clark yarn. They're super fingering for socks and sweaters. Yeah, it's just a really like basic workhorse. I do see a lot of patterns for this Red Heart yarn that are just socks, like baby booties, that kind of thing. Like it seems like it was trusted to be like a really kind of hardy, hard-wearing workhorse.
Since that had a strand hanging out, can you show us? It's 2-ply, isn't it?
Well, let's see. So I think this one kind of,
Because they're calling it fingering, and I wondered how that compares to what we call fingering today. Does it look the same to you?
yeah, so it's a 3-ply yarn.
3-ply.
So, you know, you see a lot of vintage patterns that call for 3-ply. Based on the gauge that I can get, especially in England, a lot of the English patterns say 3-ply for fingering. I would say based on the gauge that I can get that this is pretty accurate for a 3-ply yarn, like what England was also using. It's just, I don't know. Like, trying to think of a, you know, like a Cascades fingering yarn, their fingering yarn. This feels, it's like it's denser because there's more plies to it and there's less air in between the plies. Like it's a nice solid piece of yarn. You can see that this isn't really going to pill. Like it's a pretty tightly spun yarn, but it still feels really lightweight in your hand. Like it doesn't feel like, have you ever knit something with yarn so dense that you feel like you could like set it down and it would still stand up like on its own?
Well, things that are stranded, yes.
Yeah.
Either that or a heavier weight. Like
Yeah, but
once
like,
I get into worsted weight, then I feel it has that stiffness, but usually not finer gauges.
yeah,
It would be
I don't know.
so interesting to see that next to a Cascade. Cascade's 2-ply, right?
Yeah, Cascade's a 2-ply.
So you're saying that's airier because there's more space. I guess the geometry of these two cylindrical shapes coming together. When
Yeah.
the third one, like triangles have more stability, think of a tripod.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking that there's something about the geometry of those three things that
Exactly. Yeah.
nestle
Yeah.
up against one another more tightly. But still the overall diameter may be similar.
Mhm.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it would be nice to be able to compare these things. This is
Mhm.
an assignment for Roxanne Richardson. She does this kind of thing.
Yeah, this has just been like my personal conspiracy theory. Like I'd love to see somebody like make like a big spreadsheet with like their actual like wraps per inch and how much it weighs, but like that's just my personal conspiracy theory, like when I work with vintage yarn versus modern. Like yeah, but yeah, you put it well. And then here is my last little skein of vintage yarn. I love the label on this
The
one.
color.
I know, it's another 50s like aqua tone. So it's the Botany Brand, and they did quite a few. You can see this really cute little label with the person knitting on it. And then it also has the Botany Mills logo on the back there from New Jersey.
Passaic, New Jersey. It's
Yes.
just a river from where I am.
Yeah, I love the Botany yarns. They have, so they all are tones, something tones yarn. So this is the Saxotone. From the best that I can tell, the tones, there's like what's the other one that I found? It's oh gosh, I can't remember now, but I have found another something tones yarn, and it seems to do with different color families because they're still the same weight and the same amount of yarn. But the Saxotone seems to be kind of more their bright one. The other one that I found was like their pastel color range. So I have like, I actually used one of the tones. The other tone that I have is the pale green right there. And that's like their pastel color family. Yeah, so that's another one. I have found a 1950s pattern where they use the Saxotones for the main body of a sweater, and then they use a something else tones that comes from the dark color family for like a yoke around it, just like a solid color yoke. So I'm on the hunt for the darker color one.
The sweater that I'm knitting right now, the original pattern calls for the color Sax blue, and it's spelled S-A-X-E. That was a color, that was a thing.
Okay. Yeah,
Of course, I'm not using that color. You saw what I'm knitting, and there's no blue in it, but I wonder if that Sax was always with the blue family, maybe, because your green is sort of, it might not have been the pinks or the reds that were anything Sax. I don't know. Just
to be, yeah. Yeah, because it is so hard to find anything about these yarn companies because either they went out of business or they were bought up by another company, but most of them don't really keep archives of their patterns or their history. There's nobody you can reach out to and ask these questions. And again, that's where primary sources are really helpful. Things like newspapers and just sort of comparing what you find and like kind of keeping track of these things. That's really the best way you can research them, because otherwise it's just a lost history. So it's a real shame.
If I started down that rabbit hole, you might never see me again, because that's the kind of thing that I really love to do, like to dig and research and look for the people who are still alive who might have worked at that factory. Sometimes there are lawsuits, and you might find, you know, so-and-so sued them because they bought the yarn to do some big production assembly thing and the yarn fell apart, or, you know, you never know. Once you go into that research realm, you can get lost for a long time.
Yeah.
Don't sign me up. It's addictive for me.
And I think I forgot to show you the vest that I'm working on, the tartan, the label on that. It's a Fleisher's yarn. It's Castle Lane. I believe Fleisher's, Columbia, Minerva, and Bear Brand all did a Castle Lane. And from what I could tell, they appear to be interchangeable because I've seen knitting pattern books that call for any one of the three. Yes, and it seems like this yarn was made starting during World War II and continued into the 50s. I'm guessing this is probably not World War II era. I think it's probably like later 40s, early 50s, based again on you looking at the logo and comparing. So it actually probably is from about the same time that, again, the vest pattern came from. So that one, I'm a little smug about that one, like how perfectly it's coming together.
The color's very interesting too.
Yeah, it's kind of a warm gray, but in some lights it looks a little brownish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of
like a muddy color.
Yeah.
Or putty even.
Yeah.
It's not a modern color.
It's really not, no. Like I can't really, like I maybe will see like a variegated, like a sock yarn, like a hand dye that maybe will have a splash of that color in there, but not like a full skein. I think you'd have trouble trying to match that.
I wonder if there are people in the United States, maybe people who work at museums or who are really into textiles, who would know, like, I don't know how far back Pantone goes historically, but that might have been like the Pantone color of the year, 1943. Like,
could be, yeah.
It would be interesting to know. That might have been a color.
Yeah.
That was popular.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there's somebody. That sounds like somebody somewhere is probably knows it all. So I also brought some historical knitting needles
Okay.
that I have, again, sort of amassed over the years. I have 3, these are early circular knitting needles. So the first patent for a circular knitting needle, I believe, is either 1917 or 1918. But they weren't sold commercially until the early 1930s. And I have found some 1930s knitting patterns that specifically call for using a circular needle. They are not like the circular needles we are used to today. These either came from the 30s or the 40s, because the 30s and 40s circular knitting needles are 100% wire. They're all wire. I can even like rub them against each other. They make like a horrible like metal grinding noise. I have tried to knit with these and they're terrible. They're just terrible because the join is so like there's such a gap between the join and the needle that your stitches just get stuck. And I mean, you can see trying to bend it that they're really rigid. Like they're just awful. It wasn't until the 1950s where they started being made with nylon cord. And that's when people started using them a lot more frequently, because then they suddenly could bend a lot easier and you could have like that seamless join between the needle and the cord. But yeah, it is really cool to see, like, because I only use circular knitting needles. So it doesn't matter if it's flat or in the round. So it's cool to see like their forebears.
I had never seen those.
I found one at a Goodwill a couple years ago, and actually last month was at an estate sale, and the person, the collection that I found at that estate sale, the person was obviously a very avid knitter, and I found a lot of really cool stuff there. And she had a decent sized collection of old circular knitting needles. So yeah,
I think it'd be very interesting to knit with that. It didn't look that rough, the connection part. And I wonder why they didn't just make it like solid, you know, taper down from wide to thin, as long as it was the same material. I wonder why they had some kind of a break there.
I don't know. Probably something to do with just the manufacturing, like the engineering behind them that I don't know enough about to like hypothesize. But yeah, I do also own a few pairs of the 1950s, 1960s ones where it's all just solid nylon, and they genuinely feel like modern circular knitting needles. You almost couldn't even tell that they're not brand new. They feel so nice. I also like to collect, even though I really only use straight knitting or circular knitting needles, I do like to collect straight knitting needles as well. And straight knitting needles, your best bet to tell if they're older or newer. For the aluminum ones, well, it's really fun when you find them with the packaging still on, and you can see like the little person knitting on there, very 50s. I like these ones because they came with their own needle caps as well, which I think is just precious. And you can see they were 49 cents too. That's quite a bargain.
49 cents.
But so like Susan Boy as a brand has been around forever. So like if you find a Susan Boy knitting needles and the logo really hasn't changed, they're a lot harder to date. But most knitting needles that are metal will have the brand name either at the end or like on the needle close to the end. And just try looking up and seeing about when these companies were in business, and you can kind of, again, get that sort of rough idea of when the knitting needles were made. But again, it's most fun if you find one with the packaging still on.
I have a Susan Boy crochet hook from the year 1. I think the price on it is 10 cents. Oh. And that's like engraved right into the metal.
Yeah. I also really like celluloid knitting needles.
My first pair. I still have them from my childhood.
Oh, that's lovely. That's
I don't know where they came from. When my mother taught me to knit, I was 4 years old. They're short. I have them. I could probably pull them out and show you. I have shown them on another episode. I don't know where she got them from. It seemed like something she had. It was the only pair of knitting needles that I know of that were in my house. And she taught me to knit on those. And I I'm so thrilled to have them. And it's that blue that you showed us, that sort of,
Yes.
1950s aqua color.
I have very green ones, like that minty green.
Mine are a little bluer. Mine are more like a turquoisey color.
Yeah.
And mine are short. Those look longer. Let's see those.
Yeah, these are pretty
Yeah, those
lengthy.
are way long.
So the big disclaimer I want to give with celluloid knitting needles and anything celluloid is that it degrades and it is highly flammable. So if you want to have celluloid knitting needles, because they are really pretty, if they come in bright colors, they look really fun, keep them out of the light and keep them away from a heat source because they go up like a flash. Like they're like a flash point. So I do have a little collection and I do take that as like responsibility, like to own them. But yeah, you can kind of tell the celluloid because I mean, one, they sort of feel a little like rubbery, and the thinner ones especially are very, very bendy. They're not like Bakelite where they have like a really distinctive odor or anything like that. It's kind of more the feel. They did make Bakelite knitting needles. I have not found Bakelite knitting needles. One day I will. One day I will get my hands on some.
I think mine are size 6, so they're somewhat flexible, but they're not super flexible, especially because they're short. Yours look really like weeds.
So these are ones, and they are Hero brand. I also brought these white ones with the little black tip. These don't have any size on them, or not at the ends, but they're Cinderella brand, and they're made in Czechoslovakia. As another side thing, the country of Czechoslovakia is a great way to date things because the name changed so frequently throughout the 20th century that sometimes it had a hyphen, sometimes it didn't. So that's also like, look, if you see something with Czechoslovakia on it, like check to see what years it was going by that version of Czechoslovakia for date. But yeah, here's another longer pair. These are probably like, I would say maybe like a 3, I would say. Doesn't say on them, but I think they're like a 3. And these ones I was really excited to find. These are Berkelin brand, and these are number 3, and they are tortoiseshell colored. So you can see this one's not quite as tortoiseshell-y as this one is, but you can see there's that like really pretty ambery colors in them. Yeah, I was really excited when I found these ones.
Those are beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah. And then for my last couple of things, I wanted to show off my very oldest knitting pattern book. This was actually very, very kindly sent to me by somebody who saw one of my history of knitting lectures. She asked me if I wanted to have some of her mother's knitting ephemera. And she's mentioned one of the things she had was a booklet from World War I from the Red Cross. And I had only seen one of those in a museum. The World War I Memorial in Kansas City has quite a decent amount of knitting ephemera there. I had never seen one in the wild, not in an antique store, nothing like that. And so of course I was like, yes, I will take it, thank you. But yeah, it is a Red Cross pamphlet from World War I on how to knit comforts for the soldiers. So there's all the photographs of soldiers. So this is from 1917, and it does have the notes from Mrs. Laughley. She left her notes on the pamphlet. So people are knitting comforts for the war effort prolifically. Like thousands and thousands and millions of objects were knit and donated, but it's really hard to find knitting pattern books. My guess is that so during World War II in the US, there was a lot of paper drives because paper was being used by the army for things. And so people were recycling and donating a lot of paper materials, or also just like during the Great Depression, using it for like fires and stuff like that, or just repurposing it generally. I suspect people didn't really love the reminder of World War I and were therefore easily parted with knitting patterns from World War I. It maybe didn't remind them of a great time. And I think that's probably why at the time there were thousands of these knitting pattern pamphlets circulating around, and now you can't really find them. That's my personal pet theory. Because yeah, I really don't ever see those in the wild.
It just warms my heart to know that my grandfather served in World War I for the United States Army, that he may have worn one of these things that was knit by Mrs. Who? What's her name?
Lafley.
Mrs. Lafley. Thank you so much. If you're the grandchild of Mrs. Lafley, well, let me say thank you on behalf of my grandpa.
Yeah, no, and I am very honored that that person reached out to me and asked if I wanted it. Like, that's a really beautiful piece of history.
Yeah, wow.
And kind of on a similar front, I also like to just collect any sort of like little ephemera that has knitting on it, like cards, little valentines, things like that. So this is a World War I era postcard. It's never been used.
Oh,
You can see we've got a little doughboy and a girl, and she's knitting for him. And at the bottom it says, "Same old yarn."
Aww.
And then yeah, it's like the sheet music I have back there. I just anything knitting on it. I will hoard it and show it to other people. People come to my house and I'm like ready for show and tell. I'm like, look at all my things.
You've come to the right place. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, I do have one last thing to show you. If you'd
Oh,
like
okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It is my knitting tattoo. There's a little flapper and she is knitting on there. And yeah.
I love her little fringe hanging down.
I almost cried when the tattoo artist brought out the drawing. She was like, "Do you like her?" And I was like, "I love her."
Well, that is 100% pure dedication to our world. Wow. Okay, if you're out there and you're watching and you have a knitting tattoo, please tell us about it. Maybe you'll be a guest on Show and Tell. We could have like open mic day where everybody comes and they show their tattoos.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
But it has to be knitting related. Could be fun. I wonder how many people out there have such tattoos.
I don't know. My artist said this was the first time she'd ever done that. So at least not from her, but that's just one person.
But you're not in a real tattoo part of the country. I think Seattle, Washington has a lot of tattoo parlors. And in New York, I've seen one or two, but I'm sure there are plenty of like underground places. I'm sure there are a lot here, but it seems like of all the places I've been, Seattle seemed to have more people with tattoos.
Yeah.
Covering everywhere than any place else I've seen. So come forward. Let us know who you are. Wow, very interesting. I just wonder what else you have that you're holding back. Like you have little
more.
Yeah.
There's more. If you want me to come back, I can do a part 2.
You mean you showed us all this wool and you have like the good stuff somewhere else?
I brought
wool is very interesting, of course, but if there's objects.
I mean, I brought the yarn that has the best labels, but I have this.
Labels are spectacular.
Yeah, this is only about a quarter of my knitting collection. I have a truly embarrassing amount of vintage knitting patterns that I've been hoarding over the years, mostly from like the 40s, 50s, 60s. But yeah, I have a ton of them. And then I also have like some yarn sample books and things like that, you know, yeah. So if you want me to come back sometime, I can always show more.
Excuse me, what about objects that you've knit that are other than a garment, other than like a standard accessory? I mean, are there things like covers for some object that we're not familiar with in the 21st century?
Well, I have done, I did another so for after I did the Fiber Nation podcast, I came back and did a live show for them, and we called it Weird Knitted Shit, and it was mostly mostly like covers for things and bizarre toys and like medical devices that are safety hazards. So one of the things that I showed in the program was a silk cover that had a silk ribbon and bells on the end of the ribbon that was intended to cover your ball of twine and hide the twine under silk and bells. I don't have much of a need for that.
Hide it from who? Your cat?
I don't know.
The moths? Who's it hiding from?
I have no idea. The only
That sounds like a thing that I've seen people put over glasses. I think it might be like a Spanish or Portuguese thing, a little circular thing with decorations around it that you put over your glass so that no flies will go in.
Yeah, it kind of looks like that, but it's for twine. Those, I like to look at them and I like to think about them, but they're not something that I really feel a call to make. I mostly make garments for things that I can use. So unfortunately, I don't have anything like that hiding around here.
And you haven't collected, you haven't found at any of these auctions or estate sales? No, little, like.
I did recently find a pair of probably World War I era stockings that are definitely hand knit, and they like have all the like beautiful repairs on them and everything too, and they just look so beautiful. So I've only found like practical things like that. I have found a couple sweaters that I think were probably from the 60s that were definitely handmade, but yeah, not anything like any little goofy, like, that's the occasional toilet paper cover. That's about it.
I think there was a lot of crochet stuff like that. I remember from when I was young that people were knitting, not knitting, crocheting covers with poodles made of yarn, like pom-poms on the top to cover your toilet paper, and liquor bottles. Yeah.
I do want to add, like, if you if you're watching this and you want to, if you feel interested and like compelled to collect vintage things like this too, don't be intimidated by like the idea that these are going to be really expensive things. Really, estate sales are like a great way to go. This whole bundle of knitting needles I got at an estate sale, plus 2 of the wire circulars for $1 for the whole collection of circular knitting needles. And like this was $3 on eBay. Like, I don't like to spend. I'm a librarian, so like I don't, I'm not bringing in big paychecks, but I still like to have my, I still like to collect and find things that I think are beautiful and decorate my house with them. And eBay can be really hit or miss because you're bidding against everybody all over the world. Etsy can be kind of hit or miss. But definitely like visiting estate sales, visiting thrift stores, because a lot of times also the people there maybe don't know what they have if it's hobby related. If they don't knit themselves, they can't tell that this looks older. They just see ball of yarn, 50 cents. So
I did an estate sale of my mother's house after she passed away. And I can tell you firsthand that when you have a house full of stuff and you need to clear that house out so that you can sell it, because that's where the big money is, you just start giving stuff away. Little things that nobody wants. I mean, I sold all of her vintage Tupperware, a whole kitchen full of Tupperware from the 60s for $20, all of it. And I was thrilled to even get that because there's so many other things that are bigger ticket items that you're focused on, and you got to let stuff go sometimes. Time is of the essence often. So, sometimes they call it fire sale because you got to clear it out. So that's an interesting and a really great point. Yes. Some of these things nobody else wants, go get them. They're yours.
Yeah. And, let them find a home of somebody who knows what they are and knows their history and, thinks they're beautiful. So.
Well, good luck to you to continue collecting and building out all of these interesting objects. And maybe some people will reach out to you and say, hey, I have some of those, want mine too? Maybe you'll get lucky here. Liz, thanks so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
There'll be links. Are you on Ravelry, by the way?
I am on Ravelry, yes.
What is your handle?
Bewitching Woolens.
Bewitching?
Yes, Bewitching Woolens.
Like do bewitched? Okay.
I got that from a knitting pattern. It just was described as, the sweater was described as Bewitching Woolens. I like that so much.
It's cute, it's adorable. And you're on Instagram?
No, I don't have very much of a social media presence. I have a link tree that links to like other like podcasts that I've been on, upcoming programs that I'm going to be on if I'm doing things at a library.
How can people find that?
linktr.ee. So it's like Linktree, but with the dot before the two E's, / Liz Kristan. And that'll have like, that's sort of like the hub to all of the places that I've been and where else you can find me. My Ravelry's on there, my email's on there, all that kind of
Oh,
stuff.
excellent, excellent. So I will put that on the screen. I'll also put it on the show notes, and I'll test it and make sure that I've got it correct. Okay, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.